Yes, okay, so without further ado, please, Matthew, you can present your material today. Thank you.
Yes. So good evening from the United States and good morning to everyone in Indonesia. Today is Monday, October 4th, and we are looking at the best practices in literacy. And as always, I will start with the overview of the presentation to guide our discussion this morning. So we'll start as we have before with what are some thoughts about what we already know. And I think this is an important approach for teaching students to build on their already present understandings and to be in conversation about how this new learning might align with what we already know. We'll talk about comprehensive views of literacy and why they reflect best practices of literacy. And then I will spend time going over 10 evidence-based practices that the research literature suggests are current understandings about the best ways to teach and interact with literacy. I will talk a little bit about an activity that I do with my students where they set goals for literacy for their future classroom. And then we'll talk about the importance of knowing our students and how often best practices in literacy are rooted in drawing on students' cultural and linguistic backgrounds, their families, and their home literacy practices. And then at the end of the time, we'll reflect back on our learning. And of course, as we have been doing, we will end with a time of questions and answers. So again, I would ask, what are some of your current understandings about best practices in literacy as you have read in your textbooks or as you have encountered different journal articles? I think it's important to kind of, take your own understandings for where you start as we enter into the conversation this morning. And then second, I think we should consider how do best practices change over time? So as you know, there's a lot of changes in our world from digital literacies and from the advent of the cellular phone and from computers. And so what we understood formally 20 years ago or 30 years ago or 40 years ago, some of those practices are the same and some of those practices have shifted. And so often best practices change over time because we have new understandings based on new experiences. And because we try out some theories and former understandings maybe are less effective than what we've learned from the research more literacy. And then of course, underscoring this morning's conversation and the conversation that we've had ongoing in the 3-in-1 program on shaping digital literacy practices and competencies is this idea of how can we design lesson plans or curricula and instruction that builds on these current best practices, right? So it would be one thing to be aware of what best practices are, and there would be another thing to not necessarily teach to those best practices. And so the hope that I have for us this evening is that you can then design lesson plans and curriculum that build on these best practices. I would also like to note that these best practices are coming from a Western orientation. So most of the research that I draw on is international, but from UK, Australia, New Zealand, more North American and European tradition. And so what works well in one context necessarily doesn't work well in all contexts. And so I would encourage you to also think about what are the best practices as understood in an Indonesian context, and how do they align with or how are they different from the best practices that are shared from this perspective. So as I noted, just in the previous slide, when we consider what makes something best practice, it's really important to know that this understanding shifts over time. And sometimes these shifts happen rather quickly. And as I noted before, it's often based on the research and what the research would tell us. But it's increasingly understood as being centered in communities. And so for a long time, there was a focus in most of the research on cognitive processes of learning to read or cognitive processes of writing and tracings and script. But ultimately, many of the theorists that we're working with in the current context are speaking about how important it is to understand the local community and how the local community shapes the culture of literacy practices. And I think I've noted this before in other situations, but when we think about literate practices, are there family traditions such as like the reading of a holy book, or are there family traditions around oral storytelling, or are there family traditions around maybe even cooking, right? So you're making food and you're reading recipes, or you're talking and measuring different ingredients, and as that's happening, there's the sharing of knowledge between a father and a daughter, or a grandmother and a grandchild. And so oftentimes, it's easy to overlook out of school literacies because, school-based literacies are reading and writing and a focus on these skills, right? Maybe speaking and listening as well. But generally speaking, there's so much rich literate practice that happens beyond the four walls of the school, and we would be remiss not to address those things. And then the last is, this focus on evidence-based best practices. And in the US, there's been ongoing debates. Often these debates are centered around like kind of two opposing views. So in the US context, for many years, they have what they call the reading wars. And so some people, are really focused on phonics, and some people are focused on whole language instruction. And these ideas kind of go back and forth for what's best. And then the materials developers, so the people that write textbooks and curricula, often take one view and then the other view. And so, I think it's an imprecise science is what I would say. It's we have ideas for what is best practice, but even some of those ideas are contested. And so as we think about our conversation this evening, I'm drawing on a most recent edited volume, the 6th edition of Best Practices in Literacy Instruction. And the fact that there are 6 editions tells you that the former 5, while still valid, are maybe not the most up to date. And also what we know from academic publications is that, something published in 2018, maybe they began writing these chapters in 2016 or 2017. It often takes a long time for academic texts to get published. And so, probably now they're working on the 7th edition, which will address, current best practices. So when we think about evidence for best practices, again, this is based on empirical research studies. So there are different governing bodies, in terms of standards. And one of the respected bodies in the US context that many people look to is the IRA, or it was the IRA and now it's the ILA, the International Reading Association, or what is now known as the International Literacies Association. And almost 20 years ago, so nearly 2 decades ago, they were trying to say, what are some ways that we might know that this research around these topics of what is best literacy can be trusted? And so these were the 5 different indicators. They felt like if there was data, that different people who looked at this data would come to interpret and identify similar conclusions. So people could have a shared understanding. Other researchers could both look at the same thing and say, yeah, we agree on this notion. And then a lot of it is focused on, what are the different tasks that students need to become successful readers? So in the US, in the year 2000, there was a national reading report, and it focused on 5 skills that they thought were essential for students to become successful readers. And I would note, even the change in name from Reading Association to Literacies shows a broader shift or an expanded understanding for what counts. And so even though the focus here is on reading, understandings of literacy have really shifted over the last 20 years. But essentially, can students understand phonemes? Can they understand the sounds behind the letter combinations? Do they have phonemic awareness for how these sounds are grouped together to make vocabulary words? Can they decode? Can they use context clues? The things around the words to help them make sense of the passage. Another selection is this idea of these studies could be replicated, right? So if I'm a researcher and I go in and I work, if I go in a September day, that the conditions would be very similar if I went in on an October day or a November day, or if I went in, with someone else, they would basically find that the data that is collected is reliable because it's not determined on the person, or it's not determined on the context in which the day or the time that the data was collected. And then as well, there's this idea that the data should be systematic, right? So we're looking for the same things and we're collecting the same types of data sources. So if we think about an intervention, we would want to follow the intervention in similar ways, right? We would want to not have too many variables in an intervention. And then last and not least is this idea that if you're doing research, that it would be peer reviewed, right? So independent reviewers who do not know the authors would read their publications or read their findings from this data and find it to be valid in terms of their own understandings. So there's a clear methodology that explains this is what we did to support students' literacy development. Other people could go in and do the similar thing, and that these results would be important. So again, when we think about this call for evidence-based best practices, the evidence-based best practices based on research are based a lot of times on the ILA's understandings of what kind of data and what kind of studies can be understood or viewed as reliable and understood as and viewed as what is the best understanding based on the designs of studies currently enacted. So then, a lot of my work is trying to focus on assets-based orientations, and assets-based orientations lead with the idea of that students come to us with a lot of knowledge and a lot of expertise. And so when we think about this, historically, the field has also maybe grappled with deficit, right? So students can't, or students won't, or students don't. Or sometimes families, like in the US context, there's a lot of negative beliefs around families, like families don't read to their kids, or families don't have books in their home, or families don't really care about their children's literacy. And in the US context, this has often been connected to racial difference or ethnic difference or class-based difference. So there might be an idea that, middle-class parents provide better literacy instruction in their homes than working class parents. And that middle class students show up to school with an advantage because they have a richer background than students from lower class backgrounds or students from ethnically or racially different backgrounds. And so the field has really had to grapple with this ongoing negative framing of students. And so when we think about what is best practice, I would argue that we should definitely focus on the strengths rather than focus on what is lacking. And so I would encourage you to do the same. Now, this is not to say that there are some students who don't have a lack. This is not to say that there are not some students who need additional supports or that are not starting at the same place that we wish they were. But if we only focus on the negative and not the positive, then it's very difficult for students to not feel like you're looking down on them. So students are very well aware of how they are positioned by teachers and by the school. And so the more we can focus positively on what is present and build with that, the better, I would argue. Now, again, I'm speaking from my own cultural context because I'm an educator in the United States and I work within the US context. But these are kind of the guiding parameters from our Ministry of Education, our national governing body over educational teaching and learning. So they want to focus on these, they call them the Big Five, and the Big Five are phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension. And again, this is based on the National Reading Report, which was done over 2 decades ago in 2000. But they have basically found that the best way to support students as they develop in their reading, which is a core essential literate practice, is a targeted focus on these 5 skills to integrate the instruction to bring attention to helping students develop and cultivate phonemic awareness, knowledge of phonics, increase their fluency with reading, expand their vocabularies, and support them as they comprehend texts. In the US context right now, there's a key focus on informational texts, and also understanding fiction texts. So can students read a short story or a poem or a small novel and understand, or can students read a science text? In the US currently, we structure our our primary-based early literacy from grades 1 to 5 or pre-K to 3 around learning to read. And then in 4th grade, 5th grade onward is this pivot to we read to learn. So 3rd grade is often seen as the pivot point in the US, where the focus goes from learning how to read to using these reading skills to learn content knowledge. They also recommend that instruction be systematic and sequenced, right? So when we think about teaching, best practices for literacy instruction would be would follow a natural progression, and it would be scaffolded, right? So when we think about curricular design, as we do a scope and a sequence for maybe a semester, we introduce the ideas, we practice the ideas, we reinforce the ideas, and then we start all over again. So across the semester, there's a spiraling between what we've already taught and what we've already learned, and using those old skills to build new skills, and then reinforcing whatever students maybe did not have a good time learning the first time around. So this systemic and sequencing shows an intentional design. We're not just showing up to the classroom and doing some stuff with kids. There's a method to the approach that supports them in their learning. This is a really big one, the 3rd bullet point, instruction that uses materials that are engaging and relevant to students' needs. So United States, has had a large number of shifts in demographics. And so if students don't see themselves reflected in the curriculum, it is hard for them to be motivated. So the more that we can focus on the context of students, and I think sometimes if you're using an international curriculum, maybe the focus is a different cultural background than the country that you're coming from. So sometimes we need to bridge the instruction so that we're not just teaching a different culture to our students, we're reflecting on our own culture and how that supports our learning. And then the other thing is what some people will call progress monitoring, right? Which is the idea of like, what is their growth over time? So sometimes, there might be a pretest of students' literate skills. And then in the midpoint of the term, at the semester, another benchmark. And then at the end of the semester, so that you can look at growth. Maybe you check their growth by unit, but there's this idea that as you teach, you're monitoring, and then you're saying, okay, students got this concept, I can move on to the next concept, or students did not get this concept, and now I must remediate. I must again give instruction to further support their learning. So these are things that our Ministry of Education suggests are most important for cultivating and developing best practices for early childhood literacy. Again, thinking about pre-K, K, 1st, 2nd, 3rd grade. So basically students from ages, 4 or maybe 3.5, 4 to 9. And all of these things, are cohesive, so they work together. So it's sequential, it's monitored, it's engaging, it's relevant. And when you have all of these conditions together, it creates better experience for students' literacy learning. So I'm going to show you now a series of different graphic representations. And the reason I do this is just to show that different units can organize things in different ways. So this was from a Google search that I did for images around best practices for literacy instruction. And this was coming out of a Hawaiian context. And so, in the Pacific Islands region of the United States. So that they suggest that high quality best practice in literacy instruction in the green is informed by all of these blue hexagons on the outside. So again, very similar to what we saw in the slide before, talking about continuously monitored to gauge effectiveness. That aligns with informed by multiple and continuous assessments, provides rich context for learning, aligns with this idea that instructional materials are engaging and relevant to the student's needs. Differentiate instruction would suggest that we, target our learning to different students, right? Not all students learn in the same way. Provide opportunities to build positive student identity. So you can see how even though some of these are worded differently, there's somewhat of a consensus or somewhat of a shared understanding or an agreed upon idea of what allows for best practices. This one would suggest that there are multiple forms of texts at multiple levels. So, if we think about Vygotsky and his sociocultural theory and the idea of the zone of proximal development, the ZPD, this idea of drawing on text with multiple forms and complexity of levels would suggest a ZPD approach to helping students to grow in their levels. And then embedded skills and strategies through active and explicit instruction, again, would align with this embeddedness of the phonemic awareness or phonics or fluency or vocabulary and comprehension. Collectively, these skills are targeted through the instruction. So again, good literacy practice is designed from the start. It's not accidental, or it's not coincidental, or it doesn't just happen decontextualized, right? There's informed choices that make this work stronger. Okay, so now I will play another image, and again, you can compare and contrast. Again, these are different visual representations for how different bodies view best practices in literacy instruction. So we can see this one puts the student or the learner at the center, and it talks about aligning instruction to curriculum standards. It talks about bringing in families and communities, teaming with them. It talks about collaborative leadership, around assessment, around developing professional learning networks for teacher effectiveness, and around different supports for students through multiple tiered levels and through interventions, right? So again, even though this is a different graphical representation than what we saw in the slide before it, we can see that it aligns with some of these ideas, right? So best practices building on the strengths of the community, and that shows up in the slide. Best practices is designing instruction that's systemic and sequenced, that's monitored to gauge effectiveness. So we can see that even though there are different representations for what might be considered best, there's kind of, as I said before, a consensus or an underlying idea that these are the practices that are most effective, right? And then this is, again, a different one looking at effective practice for literacy instruction. And again, we can see many of the same ideas represented. So partnerships probably refers to families and communities. Engaging learners with texts means that if we want them to engage with texts, that they should be somewhat culturally relevant, right? Instructional strategies goes back to the focus on phonics, phonemic awareness, grammar, fluency, comprehension, setting expectations, right? So this could, again, align with the idea of ZPD. We want to have high expectations for students' literacy learning, but we don't want to overwhelm them where they feel like they have to shut down. And then, of course, the knowledge of the learner is key. So even though these are three kind of cyclical models that put best practice instruction in the center, they say many of the same things in different ways, but they all have a similar feeling about what we can best do to support students, right? And some of this might be just intuitive. We might know it just because we believe it to be true, but it's also good to know that the research backs up and suggests that these are the effective dimensions of different literate practices. So I think, sometimes these visuals help us to understand. Again, even though they're put in a circle, I would suggest that they, it's not like one leads to the other. It's all of these things are working maybe like in an ecology. They're all working together to support the students. And so it's not like you start in one and you go to the next, but all of these things are informing the literacy instruction in the context in which you are working. Okay, so I do want to give a small caution or a small warning. And in the US context, it's that sometimes best practices for literacy instruction are connected to commerce, right? So some educational company says, if you follow this approach, you'll get the best result. And then they just want to sell you their curriculum. Or they want you to, buy into their conferences and come to our conference or come to our professional development. And so one of the contested groups right now is this National Council for the Teaching Quality. And so I have this list for us, and I'm gonna stop the share here, and I'm going to go and now share the website. And again, this is a U.S. based organizational body, and they say that they're concerned about the teaching quality, right? So it's framed as if we want good teachers because we want good teachers for students to learn, and it's best if we have high quality teachers because high quality teachers will mean that there's a better chance for student learning. So what they do is they often look at US institutions of higher education and they go through their syllabi and they say, you know, based on what we see, these people are either doing good preparation for early reading instruction or they're doing bad instruction for early childhood reading, right? So again, you can see that they have, you know, maybe a mother and a daughter or a teacher and a student. But there's this, the website makes it look like they really care a lot about literacy practices. And they do care about literacy practices, but the reason behind it is they want to shape more policy for themselves and for their materials, right? So you can kind of read here, you know, reading proficiency underpins all learning, preparing teachers, pre-service teacher preparation, that systematically and explicitly addresses the 5 essential components of effective reading instruction, ensures that teachers will enter the classroom ready to teach children how to read. And again, when they say those 5 essential reading instruction, it's those phonics, phonemic awareness, you know, comprehension, fluency, etc. But then we can see here in their materials, they already begin with a very deficit-based lens. So they say more than a third of American children cannot read by the 4th grade. So they don't lead with the fact that, you know, 2/3 of students are well prepared to read. And they also don't look at the factors, right? So they do notice that it does disproportionately harm students of color, but they tell only part of the story, right? And so what they're saying is like, look, of all these programs, only half of them sufficiently cover early reading components, right? And then they have this little YouTube thing, but it's, you know, basically for their model and their system for how they rank these things. And again, the National Council for Teacher Quality is trying to shape their own advocacy because it's a money-making endeavor, right? So then again, only over 50% of traditional programs provide adequate instruction, at least 4 of the 5 areas scientifically based reading compared to only 35% in 2013. So what they're trying to show here is like, based on our interventions, and if you buy into our system, like the program is going to increase in its effectiveness, right? So just 8 years ago, only 35%, there's been a 15% jump when you use our resources and materials, right? And so then this is how they ranked the programs, right? 28% got an A rating, 16% got an F rating. But again, these are based on their own internal metrics that would help to share their system. Now, again, this is a very US-based program, but what I'm showing you is like, you can see how it leads with deficit. And so they're just talking about how these programs are not good. They don't do enough to look at the big 5. You know, there should be more focus on these skills, which is helpful to know. And then you can compare your state to the national averages. But ultimately, it leads from a deficit view, right? But if you buy their teacher prep review, then you can increase your scores. So I won't belabor this any further, other than to note that when we think about what is best practices, we do need to consider who decides, because often the people deciding are trying to make money for their own programs or to sell their own model, so that they can get rich off of, you know, your own institution not knowing what's best, right? It takes agency away from the local and it puts it outside the local person. So I would suggest to you that your university and your local school system or your state or province or your own national board of ministry for education does know what is best practice. And so we should be careful of these outside companies, if they exist, that are trying to, you know, influence best practices. Okay, so again, the whole goal of the 3-in-1 program, I would argue, is to cultivate a comprehensive view of literacy, right? So when we think about traditional views of literacy, it's been very, very, very focused on reading and writing. And even when we go back to the last slide, this was mostly concerned with reading development. But we know that best practices for literacy moves beyond print and text. It moves beyond pen and paper. So a comprehensive view is reciprocal, right? And this idea that both inform the other. So we think about reading and writing. We think about speaking and listening. And then, of course, in the digital era, we must pay attention to viewing of texts or digital resources and representations, right? So what does the web page look like? What are the hyperlinks? What are the organizational patterns? Is the representation graphical? Is representation audio plus video plus moving image? Is it still image? Is it a podcast, right? So when we hold a comprehensive view of literacy, we move beyond former understandings of just a focus on reading and writing, and we focus on how these integrated skills all support students' meaning making. So literacy, as we understand it today, is comprehensive. It's not either or, it's all of these together, right? So it's reading and writing, speaking and listening, viewing and representing. So all of these things are working in concert together. And I believe that many of you probably already hold this comprehensive view of literacy, but I think I would just, again, encourage you to continue to expand. What are my assumptions about literacy? What are the assumptions that are represented by my institution, by the teachers and the courses that I take? What are the beliefs behind the Ministry of Education? How does this enact itself in the local school district, right? And so if you see spots where it is not comprehensive, you must ask yourself, what can I do to make the literacy teaching and learning more reciprocal and more comprehensive, right? And in the US, right now, our focus is very much on reading and writing, and many teachers are looking to expand beyond just these two foci. Okay, so what I have here is a table of the 10 evidence-based best practices for comprehensive literacy instruction. And I'm just going to pause here for like a minute or two and let you look at the table. And then the next half hour or so, we will talk about each of these 10 different indicators, and I will give further information and expand upon these 10 ideas. So just take a moment to read and interact with this table, and then we'll go slide by slide addressing each of these 10 topics. Okay, so now we will start to go and look at each of these 10 different comprehensive practices, best practices for literacy instruction. So we begin with the idea of a literacy community, right? And this idea of literacy community is the fact that we're extending beyond just the walls of the classroom. So as teachers, can you build relationships among the local community? And how can the local community also shape and support the teaching of literacy? And as we understand from Vygotsky and other models, literacy learning is cognitive. Obviously, if you removed our brains, we could not function. But beyond just the cognitive approaches, there are social ways that our literacy practices are shaped. And so can we help students to understand how different social interactions help their literacy? So, as we think about the local community, can students collaborate with local community members, or can they consider and reconsider and rearrange their ideas based on what they learn, right? Maybe you want to teach students some sort of, thing about the local community, and then they read a text that centers on a person in the local community, and then maybe someone from the local community comes in as a classroom visitor and works with and addresses the students. But generally speaking, we want to extend the literacy beyond just the teacher and the students, and have other members of the local society also support the school-based development of students' literate practices. The next one is the notion of ongoing monitoring. And again, this is what I noted at the start of the talk tonight around progress monitoring. But this idea that, we're always checking in and up with students. So if the teacher is learning alongside the students, then the entire community becomes this space of feedback. And then we can shape the curriculum, right? So students are really enjoying this topic. They're very motivated by this topic. So maybe we extend and do a new activity around the same idea. Maybe students are really challenged by this or struggling to understand this. And so we spend a little bit more time remediating, right? But we understand that as teachers and students learn together, then they can communicate around, we're really getting this, or we need more time for this, or we really enjoy this, we would like more of this. And again, I think going back to my prior comments, this occurs when differences are not viewed as deficits, but rather as perspectives that can enrich all members, right? So we know that there's a difference in power. We talked about this before, that sometimes teachers have more power or school leaders have more power and students have less power. But if we're able to think about who is the end goal, right? The end goal is to promote the students and their learning. So let's listen to what the students have to tell us about the ways that their learning is working or not working. And the best way to do that is through ongoing assessment. And that can be formal assessment, or that can be informal assessment. So, I've been seeing that at the end of my talks, your teachers and professors put an exit ticket into the chat. Please complete this Google form, right? So that's a way of their ongoing monitoring of your learning, right? And so these things like exit tickets and other feedback loops then allow us to take a pulse to understand where things are going. They're going well, they're not going so well, we need some adjustment, or we're okay with things. So again, this ongoing monitoring, this ongoing assessment helps us to know in real time how to shift our instruction to better meet students' needs. So one of the best literate practices is continuously monitoring and checking on our students and their understandings. So access, relevance, and choice are increasingly understood as a best practice in literacy. And we've seen from COVID-19, do students have access to materials? Maybe they need digital access. Maybe, in the US, many libraries and museums and public spaces that generally support literacy shut down. So how do we get students access to the reading materials that they need in the midst of the global pandemic, right? Are we able to have some of these resources in our classroom if it's not in the pandemic? Are we able to get them connection to other places that have some of these reading materials? So increased access often leads to increased literacy, and unsurprisingly, if students have an access issue where they cannot get their abundant reading materials, then it does impact their literacy learning. The second notion is about relevance, and again, we've seen this time and again. Good literate practice builds on students' lives, their cultures, their religions, their experiences. And so reading and writing is not just about school-based learning, but reading and writing is about making meaning in the world, right? So oftentimes there's these binaries in school and out of school, but I would say best practice in literacy, it travels across home and school and community, right? So these things are not just related to the four walls of the classroom. And then of course, we know whenever possible, choice will increase motivation. It often leads to more reading, or it can lead to greater understanding of what is being read. and it can also support the perseverance in reading. So there's been a number of studies where they show if students are able to choose or select a text that is meaningful to them, it does all of these things. There's greater comprehension, they want to read more, they understand what they're reading better, and even in cases where the reading is challenging or the reading is difficult or the reading is maybe less easy, they continue to work and persevere in the reading. So I think if, I'm going over 10 slides about 10 best practices, but to me, this is really one of the most important ones: access, relevance, and choice. If students have access, if they find it relevant and they have choice, all of the benefits are very solid. Now, again, sometimes we are bound by the governing authority over us. So the state or the Ministry of Education dictates or demands what must be taught. So sometimes we have to choose, how do we best work within these frameworks that kind of would constrain us to still allow for access and relevance and choice. Sometimes this is easier said than done because the teacher must follow what the government tells the teacher to do. So the teacher must become creative in finding space to allow for these three things. The next practice, and again, this looks different culturally. So in the US context, students are coming from a number of different cultural backgrounds. In Indonesia, there is a lot of variety in language and a lot of variety in the country, right? Because it's made up of so many different islands. But generally speaking, we need to attend to students' different backgrounds. And so we need to definitely make sure that we are focusing on different targeted skills. And it doesn't mean that we have to focus on these skills in isolation. Sometimes we can focus on these skills collectively, but we should definitely give an explicit instruction, right? And so explicit instruction is noticing, right? We need to tell students, this is a prefix, or we make this sound in the English phoneme, in the English phonemic alphabet, it's this sound, but we don't have it in our native language, right? So I think, for example, when I was teaching in China, China does not have articles. So a, and the are not found before nouns or proper nouns in Chinese. And so I would say to students, if you're making a mistake in writing, you're often making an article error because you don't have articles in Chinese. Or I might say to them, I noticed that many of you are either saying or writing or speaking your verb tenses incorrectly, because Chinese only has a collective past tense form. And so there's a difference between English language, which has many irregular forms of these verb conjugations, and Chinese, in which the conjugation is understood based on the context. So I would direct explicitly students' instruction to these differences in linguistic features between Chinese and English to differentiate that these are things you must pay attention to when learning or studying a language in a different way. For example, also Chinese does not have the V sound. So when I would have to say to my students, you need to put your teeth onto your lip and there should be a vibration sound. So, and students have a really difficult time because the Chinese phonemic construction does not have that. And so students as well, the TH sound they don't have. And so students, find that it's very awkward for them to stick their tongue through their teeth or to put the teeth on the lips for the v sound. So we focus on this explicit instruction to let them know the difference. And then another way to differentiate instruction is through a gradual release of responsibility model. This often provides differentiated instruction because the teacher does, or the teacher and the students can do, or the students do independently. So as you are able to build students' confidence, again, this goes back to Vygotsky and the zone of proximal development, it provides a way to support their learning in ways that are most meaningful to students, where they need a lot of help from the teacher, or they need a lot of help from their peers, or they've gained confidence and they're able to do this on their own. So this slide suggests differentiation in the teacher's role, where the teacher control is high and the student activity is low, and activities where the teacher control is lower and the student activity is higher. And as teachers differentiate these instruction, they're able to move from high to low context of release of responsibility, where the teacher does more and then later the teacher does less. And as the teacher does less, the students do more. So most of what I've taught in this 3-in-1 series has been high teacher control. It's been me giving explicit instruction. I've been teaching and lecturing from the PowerPoint slides. I have been modeling different activities and giving examples to you. Sometimes I've asked for your participation in the chat. And so then it's more high student activity and I respond to the ideas that you're sharing. So, as we scaffold this approach, the idea is that after, the 3-in-1 session ends, then you guys will have the application of these my teachings to your future teaching, right? So the release for this lecture series will happen after it ends, right? Right now, there's a lot of more teacher control, a lot more explicit instruction and modeling. But then as well later, the release will change. So differentiation is really important, and it follows this gradual release of responsibility model that allows you to differentiate instruction so that teachers and students both feel competent and confident in doing the learning or the literacy learning task that is at hand. Another form and approach to best practices in literacy is the notion of using a wide variety of text. And when we think about wide variety of text, it's what could count as a text. So I will hold up this mug. So this mug comes from the coffee company Starbucks, which many of you are familiar with. But this mug is from one of the 50 states in America, the state of Michigan. And Michigan is where I did my graduate school studies. So if we think about this mug as a text, right, we have a multimodal text. We have some pictures and we have some images. And so if we were going to look at this mug, I could ask questions of students like, what do you see? And they might say, oh, I see a bridge. And then we can talk, oh, okay. So this bridge is very famous. It's called the Mackinac Island Bridge. And why is this an important bridge, right? And then we could talk about what is the role of bridges. Bridges connect things. Often bridges connect two separate pieces of land, right? So then we could talk about geography. We could talk about the fact that Michigan is 2 peninsulas, right? And a peninsula is a body of land that is surrounded by water on 3 sides, and that there are 3 major bodies of water. We could talk about the role of the bridge in connecting these 2 peninsulas, right? So from one picture and one image, we're able to talk about local geography. We're able to talk about landforms. We're able to talk about transportation, right? So even though we're just looking at a mug, this mug could be an important text for discussion in a classroom space, right? We could talk about, there's a flag. What do you see on the flag? What do flags represent? How are flags a reflection of national identity? How do different flags represent different groups? So again, this is just a coffee mug or a tea mug, but yet if I treat this as a text in my classroom space, I can have a lot of meaningful conversations with students around something that, this isn't a book, this isn't a web page, this isn't a podcast. It's just it's a physical object, but it creates a springboard for discussion. So when we think about wide variety of texts, often in school, we have great texts that are print-based, but I could bring this mug into class and we could have a whole half-an-hour discussion just about the images on this mug, right? So when we think about variety of text, are we using fiction, nonfiction, poetry, plays, magazines, podcasts, YouTube videos, TikTok, social media, right? So all of these things are important. And then I would also argue that when we use different varieties of text, we can address different issues. So like I said, we looked at the bridge and it brought up maybe some social studies, right? So let's think about landforms. Let's think about geography. Let's think about what are the advantages of, let's say for defense, right? if you have water on three sides, it means that people have to come by land, or if they want to attack you, they have to come by boat, right? So all of these things is promoting an inquiry stance, right? I'm asking students to inquire and to make meaning around this coffee mug, right? So again, when we talked, like here's a lighthouse, right? So we could talk about what is the role of a lighthouse? What do lighthouses do, right? And so they might say, oh, well, lighthouses help help ships to sea. And we could say, well, why is this important, right? Well, if the ship doesn't know where the land is, it could hit the rocks and it could damage the ship, right? And if the ship has people on it, the ship could sink and people could die. Or if the ship has goods on it, then the material resources and trade could be lost to the sea, right? So all of these things around like, this is a lighthouse, what does a lighthouse do, promotes an inquiry stance, right? Maybe you're talking about a unit on the global pandemic, right? So you were talking about COVID-19, right? So then you could ask a question about like, some countries have vaccines and other countries don't get vaccines. And is it just, if this is a whole global pandemic, shouldn't the whole world have access to vaccines, right? Why are some powerful drug companies controlling the vaccine? They want to patent it and they want to make it so they can get more money. Shouldn't a public health crisis around the globe be solved for all the people, right? So then you can ask this question around, how has COVID-19 led to more injustice, right? You could talk about how people lost their jobs or lost their family members, and as a result, they lost resources. But then you could also compare that to how many rich people made a lot of money in COVID. In fact, in the United States, the wealth of billionaires has increased by great amounts. And so we could look at, what is the role of injustice in this broader situation, right? So all of these wide variety of texts can lead to all kinds of really interesting conversations, even around something as simple as a coffee mug. So if students are reading a traditional text passage, right, then we could say, what are the headings? What are the subheadings? What's the topic sentence? What's the main idea? If the piece is a persuasive piece, if we think about genre, right, what claims do they make? What evidence do they give? How do they appeal to our sense of logic, or a sense of emotion, or a sense of morality, right and wrong, right? And so again, we would want to help direct students to the deeper meanings, like what's really going on here? Why is the author saying this? Or why is the composer making the image in this way? And again, we can help students to see, themselves in the text, right? So how does this passage relate to your own life? Giving the students, we're going to read this book, and this is the reason that we're going to read this book, right? This book will tell us about the history of our country, or this book will tell us about the history of diseases, right? Pandemics are not new. So this will help us to understand how modern science has changed man's views of death, right? Now we have good medical care, and so the life expectancy is longer, right? Maybe we ask students a question: if you could live forever, would you want to do it, right? What are the benefits and the disadvantages? Like, let's say you are able to live forever, but you will lose your family members, they will die, right? If you were the only one who could keep on living and never die, what would be the consequences of that, right? So we can, again, ask students to consider, just because something is good, like even technology, right? Technology helps us out a lot, but there's a lot of bad things about technology. So what are the trade-offs, right? So this is, again, when we read the text, what is the text saying to us? How does the text relate to our own lives? And then how can we use that as a springboard for further inquiry or further discussion? And again, it's really important. One of the best practices in literacy is not that we just read something once and we're finished with it. Sometimes we must revisit the text, or we must look at the text from a new angle or a new idea. Maybe we should look at the author's intent. Maybe we should see like whose voices are included here, whose voices are not included, right? So maybe this is a book that only talks about young people. So then we lose the perspective of older people. Or maybe this is a book that's focused mostly on women, and that's important, but then we lose the perspectives of some men or vice versa, right? Are they trying to make a argument? What rhetorically is happening here? So again, best practices in literacy have students do a deep engagement with the text. There's a close reading of the text. And it's not just a superficial engagement, but it's a taking a deeper dive into the text itself. Okay, and then the next one is access in multiple modes. And again, I led the class a while back where I said that all language is multimodal, like language itself is always multimodal. So we talked about the coffee example I gave to some students, you know, the coffee spilled, go get a broom, or the coffee spilled, go get a mop, or the coffee spilled, go stack it, to show that coffee can be in liquid form or in bean form or in package form. So when we think about language itself is multimodal, but as we engage students in literate practices, we should focus on like these connections between listening and speaking, between reading and writing, between viewing something and creating your own representation, right? And this idea that it's back and forth. It's not just 1, 2, 3, 4 lockstep. It's not linear, but it's like flowing and circular, and we go here and then we go there and then we think about this and it goes to that. Again, as was noted earlier, ongoing assessment will let students know to monitor, our teachers know to monitor their students' learning, and it will also provide a means of giving feedback to students. So if we think about it, how are we going to test our students? Are we only going to let them give a test answer by writing? Could they speak their understanding? Could they represent their understanding visually using images and things that are not necessarily writing, right? So when we think about assessing, if we're teaching in multiple modes, then we should also assess in multiple modes, right? So could students make a visual metaphor to explain something? Could students share their knowledge in a graph or chart or table? Could students build or create something that shows their learning? And then again, because this learning is ongoing, we want to have the formative assessment, again, formational over time. And then we want to have the summative assessment, which is kind of like at the end of the unit. So as we teach in multiple modes, we also want to assess their learning in multiple ways. So I would really challenge and encourage you to take inventory of your assessment practices. My assumption or guess is that most of the assessment is written. Are there ways to do other forms of assessment beyond just writing something down? Okay, and then this one is, I think, also really important in the context of schooling, is we want to move away from less relevant guided practice. So sometimes students do just a worksheet and then another worksheet and then another worksheet, or they do drills. So they just drill the subject matter. Maybe it's, you think about language teaching, so it's audio lingual method, or maybe it's the grammar translation method. So if you just have students sit in class and conjugate verbs, let's do past tense, let's do past perfect tense, let's do future tense, that can become very boring to students. So the more that we can engage them in a variety of learning tasks, the better it will be for them to engage in literate learning. So we should work towards more authentic and more inquiry-based opportunities to experiment and apply evolving literacy strategies. So maybe you ask students, like, imagine a world or imagine a context, and then they envision, what it could be, right? So these are the types of things that are more inquiry-based, right? If you could change 3 things in response to COVID-19, what would those 3 things be, right? So maybe they would say, I would increase, internet connectivity, because we know that stronger internet allowed for better connections, because we knew that we couldn't be together because there's risk of transmitting the virus. Or maybe they say, I wish that there was more information. Many people have disinformation about COVID-19. So I would want to dispel some of the false things that are said about the virus. Or maybe it's, I wish that we had more access to vaccination, right? Students would then inquiry based, right? They wouldn't just say COVID-19 is a global pandemic, or they wouldn't just say that COVID-19 is transmitted through aerosols, right? They would actually have a more, like, rather than just repeating the knowledge, they would apply their ideas to understand the problem through an inquiry-based task. So the more that we can help students to engage in this authentic tasks makes the meaning more relative and more open to the learning for the students. And then another key important factor is centering students' voices. So, and again, this depends on the cultural values behind teaching. In some cultures, the teacher should deliver the lecture or deliver the instruction, and students should, maybe just sit and receive it. But there's a common practice to ask a question. So I initiate a question, and then the student gives a response, and then I say, you're right, or you're wrong, or that was a good answer, or that was a bad answer, right? But if we want to move beyond this kind of initiate a question, student gives a response, and the teacher gives a judgment on the response, it will help to get the engagement levels higher. So what many people are recommending, at least from a Western context, is this more idea of a dialogic discussion, right? So the teacher is a facilitator, and the students are guided by the teacher. But again, we know from my other lecture about intercultural difference among teaching, right? That in some cultures, the teacher as a facilitator is a less accepted cultural understanding of teaching. So you have to decide, would my culture allow me to allow for a more dialogic discussion, right? That centers the voices of my students and allows them to grapple with issues and problems that they're facing in their learning context, right? And then finally, so I think I'm going to go back. I believe that was our 10 things. So again, this is a deeper overview of the best practices for comprehensive literacy instruction. So we have the 10 that are recommended, and then I extended the ideas for this, right? So actually, I see that the last slide is this final one, number 10. Provide instruction in and practice with technologies that expands concepts and modes of communication. So that is where we do go to the use of digital literacies. So new technology gives us potential to remove some of these barriers to reading or to writing or to learning or communicating, creating. So the more that we can leverage the digital and these technologies, it will also support best practices in literacy, and it will increase student motivation and increase student engagement. So these are the 10 best practices that I would outline for you to consider in taking up in your own future teaching practice. So again, when we think about this, the thing to consider is, how can we embrace technology and embrace multimodal texts? Where can we look for them? Where can we find them? And how can we integrate them into our curriculum? And then I think one of the things that I encourage my teachers to do are to create text sets. So a text set might be for a unit of study around an issue that is important to students, and it brings in a whole bunch of different types of texts: visual texts, print-based texts, and digital texts. So maybe students are doing a topic around changes in society, right? So the unit is on changes in society. Maybe it's around technology, right? So maybe they read a passage from 100 years ago about the modern era 100 years ago. So what was the world saying was new technology in 1921, right? 100 years ago. And then maybe I play a song from the 1920s, and then we compare it with a song from 2020. And we compare and contrast between what they thought was modern 100 years ago and what they think is modern now, right? So we have some primary source texts, and we have some digital texts, and we have some print-based texts, and we have some visual text. Maybe even I show them, this is what modern dress looked like in the 1920s. This is what modern dress looks like in 2021. What are the differences you note between modern dress 100 years ago and modern dress today? What were the technologies 100 years ago, and what are the technologies today? So I'm embracing technology, and I'm also talking about technology that promotes an inquiry stance around this topic, right? Maybe it's a unit on banking, right? So maybe you show them some charts and graphs and tables about how much does the average person save in our community? How much does the average person spend in our community? And then you talk about the role of money, right? Why is money so necessary in the world? What happens when people are greedy? What are conditions of poverty? Do we think that poverty can ever go away? What is the best way to deal with those who have less resources? How does money help us meet our basic human needs? How does money, even if we have a lot of money, maybe not give us satisfaction, right? Why do rich people still feel sad? Why can't money solve all our problems? So you could do this money topic and use digital and multimodal text to promote the inquiry stance for students. So again, as part of the 3-in-1 program, we will continuously look for the ways that we could harness different digital literacies. And then we'll spend a little bit of time here just thinking about goals for literacy. So one of the best ways that we as teachers can know what we want in our teaching is to explicitly state these ideas in writing, right? So if you're teaching English as a foreign language, or if you're teaching reading and writing and speaking and thinking and spelling, you could think about what are the goals that you wish for your students to achieve, right? How can your teaching practice and your use of the pedagogy and your use of all these other factors and forms support literacy-based learning? So I'm going to stop the share for a second, and we're going to go to a different document. Around articulating our goals for literacy. So literacy goals, articulating, which is like stating or speaking and defending your vision of literacy goals for students as literacy learners. So many of these ideas often center on our core beliefs. The values that we have guide our vision. And so as teaching professionals, we should work to clarify our ideas, to articulate these ideas, and to think critically about how these beliefs around literacy shape our own teaching and our students' learning, right? So students are part of this broader educational process. We are responsible for that. So how do we help them to negotiate for meaning? How do we help them with accessing different rich literate resources? And then also, how do we face these differences that we face in the US context, in a democratic society, right? Not all people have the same vision. So how do we navigate these visions across difference, right? So again, this is what I share with my students, and I have them write their own goals for literacy from a US perspective, but I think this could work in different cross-cultural perspectives as well. So I say to my students, I present them to this in the second or the third class of the semester. And I say, in this class, we will collectively work to identify your core beliefs about literacy and the connection to the curricular, instructional, and assessment decisions you make. Again, the talk tonight has been all about this. How do we monitor? How do we assess? How do we teach? What does the curriculum say? These things are all working together to support and to deliver our goal about literacy. So in reflecting on and discussing and writing about and comparing core beliefs, then we can, make explicit our vision, right? What does the professional literature tell us? What are my own beliefs? What are my practices? And how do all these things work together to make a vision for literacy and the things that you stand for as a teacher, that you believe in as an educator, right? And so then I ask the students these questions. What are my core beliefs and values about literacy teaching and learning? What do I really think about it? How can this vision guide the decisions that I make as a teacher? And then this next one is really important. We can have a lot of great ideas and we can have a lot of beliefs, but sometimes our systems, our schools, our laws, our bosses, our principals, or our superintendents, or the Ministry of Education does not allow for this to always go out in a good way. So what are some of the threats to my vision? What are some of the constraints to enacting my vision? What are some of the complexities, right? Maybe I say, I want my students to freely have 3 weeks to work on a unit, but then in fact, there's not 3 free weeks in the scope and sequence of your curriculum. And so even though your desire is, I want to have long time for students to work on this project, maybe the Ministry of Education says you have just 1 week time. So how do you deal with the fact that you want to give students lots of time, but there's the limit that you only get this much time? So how do you address these different issues that will come against your own vision? And then finally, when we think about exit, if a student leaves my class at the end of the semester or at the end of the grade, if the student leaves my teaching, they're done with my class, what is my view for them in terms of what makes them a good reader or writer or speaker or listener or viewer or responder, right? So they finish my class and they're going to progress through more school. So when they finish my class, what do I want them to be able to do? What is the best version of themselves, knowing that they're going to continue to get other literacy instruction, but where do I want them to be at the end of my teaching, right? So I think about myself, right? At the end of my work with this program, the 3-in-1 program, I want you as students to have expanded notions of literacy. I want you to know best practices in literacy. I want you to use digital literacy, and I want you to be comfortable with supporting students' experiences and their knowledges, right? So those are my goals for, like, at the end of this 3-in-1 session, what I hope that you would take away from this 2 weeks that we spent together, right? So all of these things are central to the goals for literacy that we have. So it's good to reflect on these ideas. It's good to write these ideas down. It's good to share these ideas. So as students write these things, they give it to me as the professor. And then I write back and I say, oh, I love this, or tell me more about this belief, or it seems to me like this vision is great, but it might be really hard to actually make a reality. You have great dreams, but some of the realities of school might crush or might constrain these dreams. So how can we be realistic between the ideal and the real, right? But by putting these ideas and thoughts into writing, you're able to know, gosh, at the end of my time together, this is what I think students will take away. And I also realize that as they do that, I am constrained by some of the complexities of teaching. So if I want my vision to become true, I've got to deal with some of these conflicts that I have that would impede my vision. So I share this link with you, and I can pass this on to your professors. These are questions that you could yourself consider when you think about your future teaching, how these goals for literacy can inform the things that you want to do, and what that might mean for your own future teaching practices, right? So each of these is really important to set these goals, because the more that you articulate and the more that you discuss what you want to happen, then you can check, am I meeting my goals? Are my goals realistic? Maybe my goals need to shift because of time. So I encourage everyone to set goals for literacy. And the best way that we can do that is to know our students, right? If we know our students, we can design our instruction around them. So in their edited volume on best practices in literacy instruction, the editors suggest what is already present in students' literacy practices. Are they leaders, artists, athletes, or do they have strong skills in weaving stories together? Are they interested in sports, extreme weather, animals, or politics? Then help your students to get to know each other through discussion and collaboration. Coming to value your students' strengths and interests and creating opportunities for them to value each other's interests and abilities will take you farther in developing a community where learning is always a shared endeavor, right? So even though our students are very different, how can we harness their shared learning in support of what they want to do as literate learners in the world? So the more we know our students, the better we can design our instruction to meet the needs and the goals. In fact, even before I did this 3-in-1 program, the leaders and I had a separate call on Zoom to talk about what are the students' needs, what are they studying, what are the outcomes and the goals. So your leaders were helping me to understand you as students so that I could design my own instruction to support your own learning. So it's always good if we think about who are my students and keep their ideas and their beliefs in mind. All right. And then there's also a strong call for connecting learners, right? So how do we affirm students' backgrounds? How can we make sure that the content is engaging to students and relevant for their lives? Again, these are things we've been talking about all this morning. I led with this about an hour ago, and I'm cycling back to it now. But we need to consider, how can I help the content that I teach them relate to other cultures, relate to the world around them? So TESOL and intercultural competence, TESOL and cross-cultural competence. All of these things are important considerations for building on best practice to literacy instruction. If we ignore these things, our instruction will not be as effective. And then another thing to consider for our students is as we give them these different variety of experiences, as we give them these different opportunities, they can meet the literacy demands that are present, right? So when we think about literacy demands, there's a lot that's required, right? For genre and for discipline. So we really need to help students with, if you have to write academic paper, how do you write an academic paper? If it's creative writing, what's the best way to use figurative language in poetry? If it's writing dialogue, right? What's the best way to make the speech act natural between the two interlocutors, right? All of these things. So then we should also consider, what is the difficulty of the text, right? Is it very dense? Is this text accessible? If the text is about content, like let's say it's about biology, and you're reading a passage around how plants make food, right? So we think about, in English, we call it photosynthesis, right? That's the process where plants grow and make their own food through their cells. But if we're teaching that in a different language, it's a very complex vocabulary and structures. So we need to think about that. And then for the genre, right? This is an informational text around plants and how plants make food. It's part of biology. It's part of a unit on cells, right? So there's all of this very specialized knowledge that we need to make students aware of. And how does it fit within the broader discipline, right? If you're teaching business English, right? So what are the skills of business English? How do you write a business plan? How do you compose a business email? How do you negotiate for a contract? How do you, use the resources to expand the business opportunities? All of these are considerations. So when we think about what are the demands responsible in the task, it's across different texts and different genres and different disciplines. So best practices does not ignore these things. Best practices designs for these things, designs for texts in genres and in disciplines. All right, and then I'll finally close out before we head to the question and answer with this idea that standards are a global phenomenon now. So it used to be that we didn't really have many standards, but now it seems that almost every country or almost every agency has standards. So if you're going to take the IELTS test or the TOEFL test, there's going to be all of these internal standards, right? So in the United States and above right now, there's an increasing focus on reading informational texts. There's definitely a call to higher order thinking. So analysis, synthesis, evaluation, and creation. And there's also an increase in digital literacies, that they want to see language teaching and learning should include digital practices, right? And so this is, again, reflective of the switch from pages in a book to screens and digital literacies. So these global ideas around best practices are also organized around these main ideas, right? That we need to prepare students for these types of literate practices, and to be successful in the global competitive world market, they need to have some of these skills and dispositions. So I'm at the end of tonight's discussion, and that will leave us some time for question and answer. But I think my question to you, as always, would be, what did you learn from what I shared? And how did what I shared tonight build on what you already knew? Are there any ideas that I shared tonight, or any perspectives that you might apply to your future teaching? How you yourself can harness best practices in literacy for your students? And then I would welcome any questions that you might have.
Okay, thank you very much, Matthew. So I have several things to highlight your presentation. The first one is we focus on the students' need. Yeah, okay, to set the goal. Yeah, of course we need to aware of our curriculum. Yeah, and then also what's that? The curriculum as well as the students level. Okay, the next time, the next thing is that the instruction. Yeah, so we need to think about how we can develop the instruction that can engage the students in the class activity. And then the next one is don't forget to evaluate frequently what have we done in the classroom. Yeah, and then the last thing, yeah, but not least, so it is about the material given for the student. It should be varied, contextual, related to the students' real life. Yeah, but then we need to consider some things, for example, the text difficulties. Yeah, and then we need also to embrace the digital material. Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That's a great synthesis and summary.
Okay. So we move to the second session. Yeah, question and answer session. So please, students, you can unmute yourself and ask the question directly. Okay, please. Anyone? Anyone, please? Yeah.
We have student raise hand.
Yeah. Okay, so we have Hasnan first, please.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. My name is Hasan Suprato. Good morning, Mr. Matthew. I have a question. Based on some resources, in Finland, there is no final exam until the student is 16 years old. Then teachers are giving the daily test rarely. What is your opinion in this kind of curriculum related to the ongoing monitoring thing?
Yeah, so that's a really great question. I mean, I think obviously students must demonstrate some sort of mastery or some sort of benchmark. In my own class, I follow an approach called ungrading, which is mostly it's feedback to students, right? So students write, and then I give them ideas, and then I give them credit for sharing their thoughts. If their thoughts are maybe not well developed, then maybe they lose some points. And I would say, if you want to further address these ideas, then I will give you the higher score. So across the semester, my students in my class just get feedback, lots of feedback. And then the final task is the examination, but the examination is often a project. So earlier I talked about the text set. So I asked students, please design a text set around a topic of your choice that includes print and digital and other forms of literacy, right? So they're applying all of the knowledge from the year to the final grade. So they get points all along, but I'm not giving them like, this is A or this is B or this is C. I'm just saying, this is great. Also consider this, right? And then as long as they revise, their score always goes up. So by the time they get to the final exam, they're able to apply all the things that they know. So I think that this approach, I think we have to assess, but I think assessment doesn't have to be a grade. Sometimes it can be ongoing learning or monitoring the progress until they perform the task at the end for a score.
Okay, thank you very much. I hope it can answer the question, Hasnan. Yes, okay, now we go to Bobby. Adam, please.
Okay, thank you for the change. Firstly, I am Bobby. I am from the Indonesian Department Language, and I'm from University of Halu Oleo. I have a question. I have been taught for 6 months, but I found some difficulties in how we understand the way of students, their learnings, and they understand the materials or the lessons. How do you see this problem, Mr. Matthew? Thank you.
So can I clarify, your question is around the like online learning, or?
It is an offline learning.
Yeah, so I think I'll talk about this a little bit in another presentation, but we know that when we design instruction, like for a class, when you just move a regular class that's designed for face-to-face online, then it's very difficult. So most online learning that's good online learning is designed that way from the start. So what we had in the pandemic was a lot of transition between like crisis-based learning, like there's a pandemic, people are getting sick, there's uncertainty. So like I do a lot of, in my classes when I teach, a lot of group work. So in Zoom, I can do breakout rooms, but in the classroom, I can walk around to all the rooms and listening to what's hearing. But in Zoom, I can join a breakout room, but I don't know what's happening in the other rooms. So maybe the students are goofing off or not paying attention or not working. So I do think there's a lot of tension because the things that we can do face-to-face are more difficult if we move them online. So most of what's happened under COVID has just been like maybe crisis management or doing the best to continue learning in the midst of a lot of uncertainty. So I think the conditions of learning under COVID have been very difficult for students and for teachers. Even like, think about in a classroom, I am looking at you as the teacher, but I'm not looking at myself. But on Zoom with my camera on, I have to see myself talking to you, and that's very unnatural, right? So there's a lot of things that have been disrupted that are just different, right? Because normally I'm not worried, like I'm looking at you right now, but I'm seeing myself. So then I'm like, oh, I look funny, like, or the lighting is not good, right? So then it changes the perception. So I think for students, maybe they feel anxiety because all their classmates see them, or like, you know, your background, right? So I'm in my bedroom. So maybe worried about privacy, or it's noisy. My family members here and my kids are yelling. So all of these things have really changed the condition of learning. So I do think, you know, when we go back to face-to-face, we should continue to consider access, you know, who gets access, what resources are there. And then every mode has like a trade-off, right? So there's some really good things about Zoom and online learning, and there's some bad things about online learning. So, you know, it's just hard. So I would say it's been a very difficult season because teaching like this is not normal, but yet it also has some good things have happened. I hope that answered your question. I see in the chat, someone says, excuse me, sir, I will write my question here because of my connection. I want to ask a question about partnerships you mentioned before. So how and with whom can we build it to create dimensions of effective practice? Also, what kind of partnership? Thank you so much. So I will tell you about one partner that I have, is a local art museum, right? So the local art museum has all kinds of art objects. And and so I take my students to the museum and they engage with the artwork. And then sometimes they use the artwork to write lesson plans. And then they share the art with local school students, right? And so this is a way to have a community partner, because my class talks a lot about multimodality. So if they go to the museum, they see all kinds of examples and experiences about multimodality. And then they can share that learning in local schools with students. So this is an example of a community partner that supports learning for my students, and then my students go and take that learning to other places. When I was working in Michigan, the class that I was in was a social studies class. So in the US, social studies can be a number of different topics. And they were in a class that was looking at comparative religion. And so it was the focus was on multiculturalism. Now, if you think about America, America is pluralist, right? So we have freedom of religion. And so some people are Jewish, some people are Buddhist, some people are Muslim, some people are atheist. And so they had 3 religious leaders come to class. So they had an imam, and they had a rabbi, and they had a pastor, right? So this was drawing from the local religious leaders who were talking about interfaith dialogue, and they came into the classroom, right? Maybe you're talking about business, right? And maybe your cousin or your uncle is a famous businessman. So maybe you have that person come into the classroom and talk about their own experiences, right? So when we think about bringing the outside community, are there local people that would be of interest to your students and that would support the topic at hand to teach them using the resources from the local community?
Okay, thank you very much for the answer, Matthew. I hope it can answer the question from, who is it? I cannot see the name.
It was from Berliana.
Ruliana. Okay, then. Anyone else, please? Oh, Berliana. Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much for the question, Berliana. Anyone else want to ask question? If you have connection issues, you can write down your question on the chat box. Okay, please. Okay. Anyone? Yeah. I think they need time to type the question.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's fine. That's totally fine.
Yeah, Bu Feptia, maybe
Yes.
while waiting for our students typing their questions, maybe the lecturers will ask or sharing maybe something while waiting for others. Yeah, because actually there are 2 semesters today, semester 1 and semester 3. Okay. Actually, this is questions, yeah, regarding to your process in assessing the students ungraded, meaning that yeah, we have a final project for the students, and then while doing the catching the final project, yeah, we have a progress In that progress, we give the feedback or we give the response toward the students' group discussion. Take for examples, we have one topic and then ask the students doing that discussion, and then after that we give the feedback or responsive feedback or directive feedback for the students, and then how to make sure actually the student active participation regarding to their discussion, because sometimes we only have one as a representative, or one or maybe two or three out of 5 or 6 students. How we assess that, or how we monitor the progress of the students. Okay, thank you, Matthew.
Yeah, so I mean, I think it's always difficult if you have larger class size, right? So I have 30 students. So my approach is, if it's a presentation, then every student should speak as part of the presentation so that I can assess all of the students. But during the semester, in my one course, we have, like I talked earlier about the dialogic, which is, just this back and forth conversation. And so what I do is I set up on Google a shared document, and then students in the semester respond to readings and ideas. And I go in, and once a week, they'll write like a paragraph. Like this week we talked about this. These are some of my thinking. And then I give them my own responses. So it's like this ongoing conversation. So across a 15-week semester, maybe there's 30 entries total. And every Friday I go in and read and respond and ask questions. So this is another way. So like, I think some of it happens in the class. And then for me, having these ongoing shared Google Forms gives also that feedback. Or maybe it's the exit ticket where, you had a question, they raise the question, you respond to the question. So I think when we talk about multiple forms, it can be written or oral or dialogue. So, but I think it's a challenge. I think it's really hard because time is limited. And if you have 100 students and you spend 1 minute, that's 100 minutes. That's a lot of time. So it's a challenge.
Yeah, thank you very much, Matthew.
Okay, I think we have one student. Yeah, Resanli, please. You can unmute yourself.
Thank you, ma'am. First, I'm apologize because I cannot open my camera because of the connection.
It's okay.
Okay, thank you. And my question is, as you presented in your material that learning has become more student centered, we now don't think student as lacking, but they came to the class with a set of knowledge that they are expert at, and they can be expert at some different set of knowledge. But of course, they come to the class, and we already have a set of goals that we are prepared, so they can meet those goals. And what they know does not necessarily not connected, but it can be pretty difficult to direct it, the knowledge what they have to the things that we already set to teach. So my question is how we direct those knowledge of the students that they already have to the goals that we already set for teaching. Thank you.
Yeah. So I appreciate this question. It is true. Sometimes there's a disconnect between the student's knowledge and the goals of the class. So we need to work for alignment. So oftentimes you can ask students to join you in a think aloud. So like maybe you're teaching about close reading of text. So you ask the students, tell me about a time that you did a close reading of a text. Like, how do you understand that term? What were some approaches you used, right? And if the students don't really share much, then maybe you can see their understandings of close reading of text might be somewhat limited. So then you can go in and give the explicit instruction, right? So when we're doing a close reading of a text, we want to look at textual features. So how is this text organized? Are there headings and subheadings? What is the genre of this text? What is the goal of this text? And then you could say, these are all part of the close reading passages, right? So you can get them to think aloud, like, what do you already know about this topic? Or how do you understand this topic? Or what are your previous experiences with this topic? And then if you hear that the responses don't show the knowledge, then you can be more explicit in the teaching. Or maybe they have an idea, but the idea is wrong. And so then you need to correct them and be like, well, I appreciate your understanding, but in fact, it's more of this and not what you said, right? So we have to, error correction should still be important, because sometimes students don't have the same understanding. But generally, I think if you can get them to talk out loud about their prior experiences or how they understand the topic, then you can redirect if that's right or wrong.
Okay, thank you for the answer, Matthew. I hope it can answer the question from recently, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Okay, we have another question from the chat box. He asking about suggestion or tips to study effectively. Okay.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think it depends on what is the topic that you're studying. I will be honest, when I learned Chinese, it was a lot of memorization, which in the Western world, they think memorization is not a good thing. But because Chinese is a tonal-based language and character-based language, there's a Roman version, it's romanization alphabet for Chinese, because Chinese is character-based. So they have something called pinyin, which is like the way to write things down. So like, you know, Chinese, the greeting is ni hao, right? But all kinds of vocabulary, right? I would just write them over and over and over again, right? So that was my means of studying. And most people think that that approach is maybe less effective, but for me, it was super helpful just to memorize and internalize the things. So maybe for you, the best way to study is to like write down the terms and definition, and then make flashcards and quiz yourself. Or maybe it's to say, okay, how would I explain ZPD to my mom, right? So my mom has not studied Vygotsky. She doesn't know sociocultural theory. So could I give her an example from my own life around what could be zone of proximal development? So I think, you know, sometimes it's just about internalizing the terms. We need to learn them. Maybe it's about memorizing the history. Maybe it's about reading something and asking like questions, right? So you like, why did the author say this? Or, you know, what evidence do I see here to back up the claim, right? So you're reading an empirical article or something like that. So there's a number of different approaches, but I think if you want to study really well, it doesn't mean you can't memorize. It doesn't mean that you can't write things down and give examples, right? So I think a number of different approaches can help you to study the content effectively. But I will say this, I do a lot of teaching for people who are preparing to be teachers, right? And no amount of memorization and no amount of study can ever fully prepare them for the classroom. They actually have to get into the classroom. And then once they're in the classroom, they have to teach and they have to make mistakes, which is, we all make mistakes. And then they can reflect, right? What went well? What didn't go well? You know, how did my pacing go, right? Maybe you want to plan a lesson that lasts for 40 minutes and in 15 minutes you're done and you've taught all you prepared. So then what do you do with the rest of that time? So I think, especially as teachers or future teachers, it's a very reflective practice. So I think one of the best ways to learn is through reflection on your practice. And that can be like through writing, That can be through talking. You could even, you could record a voice memo. So I just taught the 3-in-1 session tonight. I realized that the pacing was quite good, but I realized that I had 3 or 4 spelling mistakes on my PowerPoint slides. So I need to go back and fix those errors before I teach this again, because that was bad to have spelling mistakes, right? So then, like, I have the voice memo and I can play that back. So, all of these are different ways to support your growth or your studying, right? But there's not one way. There's, you have to have a variety of ways. I hope that helps.
Okay, thank you very much, Matthew. Yeah, so the keyword is practice and then reflect. Yeah, if you still have mistakes. Yeah, okay. I hope it can answer your question. Yeah, Fatsa. Okay, thank you very much. Anyone else, please? Okay, so we have question from Safiroh, yeah. Okay.
Yeah, so I think this is I'm going to say, like, so the question asks, sometimes you're substitute teaching a class, or you're taking for a class that someone has already taught it, and the skill is hobbies, right? Or the topic is something that the students have already done. And so what can you do to make the class less boring or more attractive? So I think this is where you can, so oftentimes we think about content, right? So if you're teaching a class on hobbies, chances are there's some sort of grammar structure. So, I like, I enjoy, I don't like, I can't stand, right? Etc. like that, right? So then I think, but like you could say, where do hobbies come from? Like, how have hobbies shifted over time? What's a hobby that your great-grandfather might have had that you won't have today, right? So I think if you can approach the topic from a different angle, or maybe you would say, okay, here's a list of 20 hobbies, rank these hobbies. Which ones are the most expensive? Which ones are the cheapest? So then you're like reinforcing other vocabulary or concepts. Which hobbies are the most dangerous? If I like skydiving, that's a very risky hobby, right? If I like mountain biking down steep mountains, or skiing, right, that can be a dangerous hobby. So I think you can have like ranking or classifying, or sorting. Those types of activities are making the topic new, right? So, what are the hobbies that are best done indoors? What are the hobbies that are best done outdoors, right? So if you can use the material and present the material in new ways, rather than just like, these are the listing of hobbies, or these are the I like, I don't like, I can't stand. So if you can internalize or switch up the talk, that will help you.
Okay. Okay, thank you very much. I think it can answer your question, ya, Mbak. Mbak siapa tadi? Oh, sorry, Mas Safiroh, ya. Okay. Thank you very much. Yeah. Any more question from the students, or maybe from the lecturers? We still have 10 minutes. Yes, Tiara, please.
Good evening, Dr. Deroo, and good morning.
Good morning to you.
Before, I'd like to apologize that I couldn't turn on my camera.
It's okay.
I'd like to ask about, just like what Dr. Deroo has mentioned earlier, the traditional practice of literacy is more focused on reading and writing, right? And to make the practice more comprehensive is we have to move beyond text. And I like to ask, if as well as, I mean, the comprehensive view is to move beyond text, such as reading, writing, speaking, and listening, and also viewing and representing. And my question is, what kind of activities to improve our viewing and representing in this context? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. This is a really great question. So my answer in the chat was to make it explicit. So I think about like social media, right? So maybe you're composing a picture for Instagram story or something like that, or you're creating a TikTok, right? So last night my wife and I went to the beach, and we got some Thai style food. And so I took this picture of the Thai noodles by the ocean, and then it is our tradition once a month to go and eat the Thai noodle by the water and enjoy the beautiful views, right? So when we think about this, this could be an example of my own multimodal composition. So there's a cultural element of the noodles. There's the way that I framed the picture. So we have the sky, we have the sea, we have the seagrass, we have the food, and we have the tradition above it, right? So we could ask students, like, show me something that a picture you took on your phone, and tell me about like how you composed this picture or why you composed this picture, right? So suddenly then the student is talking about, like, they're already saying, like I told you, like the sky, the sea, the land, the centering of the food is a part of a tradition, right? So this would be an example of a multimodal composition. And even though there's only one word in English, which is tradition, I am giving a oral discussion about the choices that I made for this thing, right? So I think this is an example where you can have students talk about the design choices that they made, like, why did you put this together, or what is this a representation of? Social media is one way to have these integrations, because we're thinking about the viewing and the compositions. Earlier, before, I shared the different metaphors, right? So maybe students create their own visual metaphor, and then they have to explain, why did you design the visual metaphor in these ways? So I think if students are talking about something they've created, that's a good way to focus on literate practices beyond just print and text. Or maybe you pull up Twitter and you have them discuss a thread of Twitter. So there's all these Twitter threads. So if you were going to add to the Twitter thread, what would you say in response to the different things that are on Twitter, right?
Okay, thank you very much. I hope it can answer the question from Tiara. Yeah. Okay. Anyone want to ask question, please? I think we still have about one question. Okay, so we have Najma here on the chat box.
That's okay. No worries, everyone. Yeah, so I think one of the things when we're dealing with some of these critical thinking is just either, sentence, stems, or even vocabulary. So kind of like they say and I say. I already shared a resource with some of the professors, right? So when we think about like a problem or issue, right? Let's say, how even the pandemic, right? So we could talk about, some people say X, but I believe Y. Or even like, I agree, I disagree, I want to qualify what was said. We have talked about A, B, and C, but I want to bring up 1, 2, and 3, like a different category, right? So I think oftentimes if we can help, with giving students language to discuss these things, that would also help them, right? So and also like in my analysis, right? Or my opinion is, all of these are different ways that can lead to discussion around problems or issues, right? I agree with one, but I disagree with two. And then as we help these students, they can frame these discussions or debates. I hope that helps.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, so Najma asking how to develop, to be able to have critical thinking. Yeah, so Matthew suggests to have agreement, or disagreement about the topic being discussed. Yeah, okay. So I think I hope it can answer the question from Najma. Thank you very much for the question as well as the answer, Matthew. Okay, next question. Anyone else? No? All right, thank you. So I hope the material presented here can give you insight, how to be a good EFL teacher later on, when you graduate from this program. Okay, thank you very much for joining our 3-in-1 program. Students, don't forget to fill out the exit ticket on the chat box, and then for my class you can directly check your attendance list on Siam. Okay, so again, thank you very much, Matthew. It's an honor for us for having you today as a guest lecturer. And then send my warmest regard for your family, your wife and your daughters.
Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.